Welcome back. I've got Rebecca Sutherland's online. Rebecca, how you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, good. Really been looking for this conversation for a bit now, so I'm really glad to get you on the show finally. So why don't you share a little bit about you and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Thanks, Michael. I'm a strategy facilitator. I love group strategy processes, and I work primarily. I'm in year 27 of working with large mission-driven organizations. I'm based in Canada, and I help those organizations and their leaders reimagine their next chapter. And so it's bringing together uh, collaborative strategy development with a good, healthy dose of imagination.
It's great and important work. And yeah, I've had the fortune to be able to participate in a lot of group type exercises. And sometimes the momentum will wane, a few days later, unfortunately, just because we're creatures of habit. But in that moment of time, we all are collectively starting to see things a little bit differently. And I really wish that every team would say, okay, we're going to take an internal champion because unless they want to put you on the payroll, you're going to go on and work on or work with some other organizations. It's on the company to keep that imagination and that spirit going. It's like, okay, we don't want this just to be another one of those events. We put the paperwork on a bookshelf and never look at it again. If we want to make some differences here, to look at things a little bit differently. Like one of the things, it's like, you know, redesign, is one of the things that you do. I know you have some pillars on your website, which I will link in the show notes. But redesign is one of those things. It's like you can fix some things without completely changing the entire model of an organization. But again, that's just a soapbox moment for people. It's like when you have an event or you go to a conference, don't just file it in a drawer and never look at it again. What action items did you learn that can make you better? Be better. If we do that, that's going to alleviate a lot of the challenges we face day after day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a few things we can do front end and later to deepen that traction. I think one of them is making these strategy development processes collaborative. So lots of people involved, well facilitated, well structured, not intended to slow people down, but rather to build that buy-in and sort of fill in some of those blind spots early so that when you're trying to implement it later, lots of folks have been involved in that process and can remember why you chose to do what you did and what was motivating about that. And I think that collaborative approach helps at the front end. But obviously, not everyone can be involved every time. And we need good, solid communication systems, both to remind people who were there and to draw in the people who weren't, to understand what good strategy is for and why it's useful. It's not just a, cross it off your to-do list because people are supposed to have one. It's really intended to provide shared focus and a decision-making filter. And so I think the other thing is that people need to see the strategy being used, see that it is embedded in systems, in reporting, in performance assessments, in the way that resource allocation decisions are made. And I think as organizations develop a bit of muscle around that, other people who may not be directly making those decisions will see that the strategy matters. So, a lot of that kind of implementation coaching needs to be built in right at the front end as the thing is being developed.
Yeah, it reminds me of a session that I participated in. This was 13, 14 years ago. Actually, might be closer to 15 now, come to think of it. But it was, one of those, and a lot of people have probably heard of this one, a true colors
Yep.
assessment. So we went through this exercise, and my CEO, I was a VP of operations, and my CEO and I both ended up being the same color. It took a 30-minute side session with the facilitator, her, me, and a couple other witnesses. I use the term witnesses because she was about ready to go ballistic. She was so bent. She said, there is no way he's like me. And she wasn't rude. She wasn't, just because of how she viewed me and how I approached things, she thought it was just absolutely impossible that her and I could be the same color in the true colors exercise. And the facilitator looked at the results and did everything and explained it. She finally agreed to it, but she wasn't comfortable with it. And so I think about that. And but what it did is it gave her the ability to kind of reimagine how she viewed me. And
Hmm.
actually, it changed our working relationship for the better. Not that it was bad before, but it changed something because I think she thought, okay, now I kind of see a little bit more of him in the way that I approach things and vice versa. And so it was an eye-opening thing. And I think that's, again, one of the big things about, when you bring in a facilitator to help your organization move forward or break through something is it helps rip out those silos and get you all in a collective state where you can, be vulnerable and share some things and insights and observations, because what you may find is you've got some team members that know a whole lot about a lot of things and you haven't engaged them about that. They want to share, but they don't know if they should or they don't feel comfortable. There's all kinds of different human elements that come into play, but it's so critically important, and that's why the work you do is so critically important.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that I think about it as helping people make sure that when they use the same words, they're actually watching the same movie in their head. We can use really similar vocabulary and falsely think that what we mean by that is what everybody means by that. And so I find that some of these facilitated conversations give people a chance to describe long form what they mean by some words that they use, for example, and then in turn gives the group a shared vocabulary with greater confidence to be in a sense watching the same movie. And I think that alignment is really important. I think the other piece of that same movie that I appreciate is also helping people actually watch almost like a 3D movie in their head, as opposed to using words and just having kind of a rough, vague pencil sketch kind of idea in their head of what they mean. It gives them an opportunity and actually sort of forces them to articulate a more detailed, vivid picture of what they mean by things. And then others can go, oh, I wasn't picturing that, or I was, or hey, could we add this to it? And in a sense, what I'm trying to do is build a really detailed, vivid, shared picture of a desired future. So it's not just like a vision statement on a wall someplace in an office, but it's actually, I do think of it as sitting together and not just watching the same movie, but in fact, creating that together. Because I think the other element of this is that I think, especially in really volatile, uncertain times, which we are clearly in, we sometimes feel that the future is being handed to us, that we're somehow like victims of it or just passive recipients of it. And I really appreciate how these kinds of group conversations can give us more of a sense of agency to be shaping that future together, so that we don't feel like that the what we're moving toward is just kind of whatever comes at us. It's actually intentionally built by this group of people. So we're kind of watching a movie, but we're actually directing and producing it at the same time. And so there's a lot of ripple effects that I think can be very positive of the experience of developing that kind of imaginative strategy together.
Something that leadership guru Michael Hyatt said back, this was during the Great Recession. He said, I'm not going to participate in this recession. And a lot of people, well, what do you mean you're not going to participate? We're in a recession. What do you mean you're not? He said, I'm not going to. I'm going to make my own economy. I'm going to do the things that I need to do to grow my business and do what I need to do, take care of my people. And that's what I'm going to do. The current climate that we find ourselves in is extremely volatile. It's, uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, kind of thing, other than the sun will rise and the sun will set. But I think a lot of people, as to your point, we'll just say, okay, this is what we have. It's like, if you can choose differently if you like. You can, if you have a good team, and you have worked with, people like yourself, you can say, okay, well, how do we navigate around this? What can we do? What can we control to accomplish what we want to accomplish? Is there new markets we want to look at? This might be a great time to do that, depending on what market you want to enter in. A lot of people say, "Oh, it's down economy. That's the worst time." It's like, but I think during the last big recession we had, the number of companies that were born that are used daily, now that were born during the Great Recession.
Mm.
So it don't use, oh, this is the worst thing ever, and life is just horrible. Well, yeah, it's challenging. I'm not denying that at all. I'm not sugarcoating anything. I know there's a lot of people that are going through, and companies are going through a really challenging period right now. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, that's been the case since the history of businesses. It's just there's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. It's what are you going to do in the good times to help you navigate through the challenging ones?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people having an opportunity to see what kind of tools they have at their disposal. That idea that creativity thrives in constraints, and there's sort of a framing piece of this where a facilitator or someone else might be able to help reframe a process, that it's not in kind of a toxically positive way, but in a, hey, creativity does actually thrive when we have limitations. If you give a kid access to the best art supply store in the world and tell them to go in there and help themselves to anything, make whatever they want, they will be paralyzed by that and really will produce very little. And yet, if you give them, 6 or 8 well-chosen, beautiful art supplies and give them the same amount of time, they will produce something amazing. And we're like that too. And so I think that if we can start seeing constraints as the sort of birthplace of creativity, that can help. And I think another thing that helps is recognizing that our imagination or lack of it can sometimes cause us to avoid solving the problems we need to solve. So let me use a couple of examples. In the financial crisis of the early 2000s or 2008, several of those kind of forensic analyses that came out of it afterwards blamed it on a failure of imagination, because people just couldn't imagine that a whole bunch of banks could fail at the same time, or 9/11 was the same. I was in New York a week ago, and I was thinking about this as I walked through the memorial site of the World Trade Center. And when you look at the official report into that disaster, the number one reason that it was attributed to was a failure of imagination. Again, because no one had imagined that an airplane would fly into buildings, and therefore they hadn't prepared for it. So there's something very practical about imagining scenarios, um, not just because it'll allow us to plan for those exact ones. It doesn't need to be an exercise in prediction or being, somehow clairvoyant. But I think it does also really help our brains when we imagine multiple scenarios, and imagine them in great detail. Because what happens is, when a whole different scenario than that actually happens in real life, our brain doesn't freak out and go, oh, uncertainty, panic, freeze, whatever we do, fight or flight kicks in, right? It goes, oh, unfamiliar. I've been here before. I have explored a variety of possibilities. This is just another one. And it kind of calms our nervous system and allows us to problem solve. So there is this idea of seeing it to be it, that developing that vivid picture of the future we want actually makes it way more likely that we're going to shape the future and sort of bend it in that direction. But even if it doesn't happen exactly that way, if we've gotten into the habit of imagining multiple scenarios and having that mental flexibility to see that there's lots of ways to solve a problem, that means that when a different scenario that we haven't even thought of comes up, our brain individually and potentially collectively is ready to be nimble and responsive in that um, unexpected scenario. So I see lots of benefits to getting this imagination skill um, leveled up.
Yeah, it's critically important to do so because whenever you find yourself with challenging times, which, well, that's called humanity, but in work or economic times, we've had, several great years. And then, during the pandemic, depending on the type of business you're in, it's either been really good or it's been uh, lesson learning, is one way to put it, where a lot of people had to pivot and make some significant adjustments to adapt to the reality that we faced for a period of time. And, some businesses, again, thrived, some have not. And it boils down to, like you said, imagine things, and not just from my perspective, not just, imagine for worst case scenarios or what if we have this downturn, but imagine, okay, what happens if we have a 2x growth on our business? What would we do with that? What
Yep.
what arenas could we go? I mean, it's not just doom scrolling or doom thinking.
Mhm.
It's, let's think about when this happens. And okay, what would that look like? Well, how do we prepare for that? So when it does happen, it then you can be somewhat better prepared than you would be if it's like, well, I didn't see that coming. And again, it's one of those things where you can do the power of positive thinking, a lot of the work that Brian Tracy does and all of that, where you're kind of manifesting in a way, what you would like to see, and you're preparing for it, writing down your goals every day and all of that. It your mindset, and you start thinking about that and you start acting and preparing for that kind of stuff. So it's setting up the conditions for that to likely happen. And just like it could be the opposite. If you think you're going to have some problems and you start behaving in a certain way as a company or as an individual, and all of a sudden it happens, wow, you can predict the future. Well, you might want to contact OLG and see if you can predict the lottery numbers tonight. Then, you'll be good. But we all know that doesn't work. But uh, at the end of the day, there's the power of thinking and dreaming and imagining things and keeping your emotions in check. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know sometimes our emotions can get, obviously excited or depressed, depending on how we're going about this. But, how does somebody, when they're going, and this is where, obviously facilitation is crucial, but if they're doing it after the facilitator has, left all of their knowledge and tools, what are some things they can do to kind of keep the emotions in check as best they can? Because again, we're emotional creatures, so we're going to naturally have emotions involved.
Absolutely. I don't know if I want to keep my emotions in check so much as I want to make sure that we're trying to align our head and heart, if I can put it that way. I mean, we make decisions emotionally primarily, and then we justify them rationally, right? And so I think for me, it's more about alignment than it is some sort of, suppression or something. But I think that when we can develop with other people, so we have that benefit of connection and the social health that comes from that, when we can develop with other people a really compelling vision of the future we want to create together, there's something very motivating about that. And I want that emotional energy that comes from engaging in purposeful, exciting work, right? So we want to be able to keep that vision in front of people so that it is actually motivational. And I think sometimes what happens is that the idea of imagination gets a bad rap. We think of it as a childlike thing, we think of it as rainbows and unicorns and fake things. And I think sometimes what I love to remind people is that sometimes it can be something as tangible as a really good mentor or role model where you go, I wonder if I could be a little more like them. Like, imagine if I could borrow just a teaspoon of that kind of magic that they seem to have. Or imagine if we learned from the experience of that company down there, or that conference we went to, or that experience that we just went through, or whatever. Imagine if we dot, dot, dot. So it doesn't have to be literally rainbows and unicorns in some other planet, in some other, you know, rules of the universe. It could be something fairly within reach, but it unleashes something imaginative in us, because I think something else that often holds us back is that our traditional strategy building tools are almost like a rear view mirror. They are data from past performance. They are, our last strategy. They are, the way we've always done it in some way. And that strategy development can become slight tweaks, but basically putting a new date on similar goals to what we had before. And I think if we can really unleash the power of imaginative thinking as a group, um, it allows us to be finding a tool set that is actually forward looking and oriented that way rather than being informed only by past performance. It's not that I don't want some of that evidence to be brought into the conversation, but I think it needs to be complemented by um, by a really serious conversation about imagination, which is an interesting interplay, right? We don't think of imagination as being serious business, and yet it can be, but we don't want it to be only that because we also want to inject this I don't want to say lightness in terms of being frivolous, but I think there's an element of we move toward that which feels life-giving to us. So if something is fun and exciting, feels meaningful, people are going to move in that direction. So when we were talking before about making sure strategy gains traction in an organization, we move toward things we love, things we find easy, things we find delightful. And so why wouldn't we try to create um, a shared picture, shared movie of the future that makes us go, yeah, I want that. I want to be part of that. I want my world to look like that. I want to be part of a team that had a hand in developing that. And so I think there's a lot of really positive emotional energy we can bring to bear on this.
Agree. And wait, unicorns aren't real? I'm just kidding. No, but if they are, if you want to imagine them to be real, they are real, and
Right on. Yeah.
that's so important. Again, going back to everybody watching the same film. I think when you can imagine things, you get to create some great things, and everything that we use today started off with someone imagining it. So think about that. Even if it's like, oh, we don't want to do that. It's like every invention that has ever existed or will exist came from imagination. So don't short play that, folks. I really encourage you to do that. So love this conversation. Where can people find out more about you and all this amazing work you're doing?
Thanks for that. RebeccaSoutherns.com. So it's the same as my name. RebeccaSoutherns.com. There's a spot there, we'll put it in the show notes, but /podcast, and there's a place where you can get some freebies and find some more information and lots of opportunities to exercise your imagination muscles. Probably the most fun element there is that we have a set of merch called Possibility Packs, and they are questions, one deck for individuals, one deck for organizations, or you can buy them both together. And they are questions to get your imaginative juices flowing because I think I think of it like a muscle that hasn't been used very much in many of us. And imagination doesn't just happen from sort of sitting there still and scrunching your forehead up and hoping that you feel more creative today. So a bit of a tool there to use as a jumping off point for groups to yeah, get those imagination muscles a little less stiff.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely have all that information in the show notes. So, Rebecca, thank you for being you and I really appreciate your time today. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks for the conversation, Michael.